Όχι, έχω ψαλτές, έχω γραμματικός, τι εσύ?
So this talk is about the Morgan Lexicon, which is a free lexicon that has been published on the internet. And probably that's what you already know about it if you've ever heard of it. The Morgan Lexicon was started by my dear friend, David Morgan. And so part of my talk will deal with David and his life. Then we'll talk about how the project got started, where the project was handed over from David and why, the current state of the project, and what we need as we move forward and look to where the project is going next. I'll give some background first on David and his life. Oh, but while I do that, I'll hand out some handouts. Could you pass these down? So David was a son of the South. He grew up in the Carolinas and went to Wofford College in 1981, where he studied math, he studied French literature, and he studied music. After graduating, he went on to a career in law. He studied and practiced law here in New York City. But after a career at one of the most prestigious law firms in New York City, where by his own admission he made more money than he knew what to do with, he became quite depressed. Early on in his career, he purchased an entire set of the Loeb classical series, both Latin and Greek, and he put it in his law firm office. Latin on the left side of his office and Greek on the right. And every day he would enter his office and think, I'm going to take a vacation one of these days, and I will read some Latin or Greek. But the vacation never came, and after spending an inordinate amount of time of his life, some of his best years, practicing corporate law and making a ton of money, he decided to leave it all behind. He left behind a corner office in Midtown in order to go back to school and study literature. And he said to himself, I really want to study classics, but I don't know Latin or Greek well enough to really get into a program that I would enjoy. So he went and he studied French literature as his foray into academia. Shortly thereafter, he attended the Conventiculum Lexingtoniense and was part of the earliest circle there. He joined, I think, the second year that the Conventiculum was formed. And under the tutelage of Terence Turnberg and many others, he became one of the most proficient speakers of that group. He continued his study of Latin while he taught French and also taught law. In fact, he was made an associate professor. He was offered an associate professorship at Columbia after an assistant professorship there, and he turned it down because he missed the South so desperately that he moved back to the Carolinas. Around that time, he also discussed with many of the other cultivators of spoken Latin at the Lexington Conventiculum about the need for an organized list of modern terms. As we all know, any of us who speak Latin at all, there's frequently a desideratum for some terms that are difficult to articulate just using the lexica that we have from the ancient world or from the medieval period. And so David began first culling those lexica that are already available for important terms. I should say that David passed away in 2013. In the summer of 2013, we had talked about starting a new project, a project of a much smaller scale, a lexicon just for schools. And at that time, David already knew that he was sick and dying. Fast forward, after David's death, I had the opportunity to come to his apartment. David lived a Spartan life, to say the least. In his apartment, he had a baby grand piano, 3,500 books, a toaster oven, 1 table, and 10 chairs. And that was his entire apartment. I should add, he also had a sledgehammer, which he used to bodybuild and stay in shape. So that's sort of my attempt to give just an adumbration of a really wonderful guy. I've put on the introduction page to the lexicon 3 lives of David's. One is written by our own John Kuhner, who is here this weekend, and he is a consummate author of the English language and wrote a beautiful life. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But moving back to the genesis of the project briefly. So during those years of, say, 98, 99 to 2007, David was an integral part, I think it's fair to say, he was an integral part of our community at the Lexington Summer Conference. And as anyone who's attended Turnberg's conference in the summer knows that he has this wonderful introduction to all the lexica that are available. So in the middle of the room, there are, 20 lexical aids. And Terry goes through each one of them and explains how they can be used. Well, that's great. There's a plethora of lexica out there for people who want to use made-up words or neologisms. But part of the problem is that there are 20 of them or 15 of them, and it is a very expensive undertaking to purchase them all. So part of the beginning of David's project was to put them all in one place. So he spent about 2 years just going through the lexica that were already published for spoken or active Latin, and bringing them together from as far-flung publications as the Saarbrücken Institute, the Societas Latina, from the Vatican, from Troutman's book, and a number of others. And he called this the Silva. This was the beginning of the project. And the Silva, as you probably know, Silva is Latin for collection. I mean, it obviously means forest also, but it can be a collection of things. And that's what the Silva is. It's about half of the project that exists today. And it exists as a mere collection. That is, there are no judgments placed on the contents of the Silva. It's sort of a depository of other lexica. So the advantages of this, as I said, is that you neither have to purchase the 15 or 20 lexica that are on the market, which might cost you $500 or more. The other advantage is that even if you already own these, you don't have to go thumbing through them. You can click, search and find them relatively easily. So another advantage, I guess, to having a Silva is that you can find words that only one person thought was necessary to coin. For instance, let's say you were at the Conventiculum Lexingtoniense or Bostoniense or any of the other ones that are out there, and one evening you get drunk with your new Latin-speaking friends and you decide that you're going to take a Latin-speaking trip to Las Vegas, right? Well, there are some words that you might need on your trip to Las Vegas that would be difficult to find in Cicero or even many of the medieval lexica that are available. And then the other real advantage, the other emolumentum of the Silva is that no matter how stupid and inane a coinage is, it appears there. So if you end up reading some of the Latin periodicals that are published today, which are really a mixture of different qualities of Latinus, you might find an author uses a word that is not of the caliber that you might like, and you might not understand it. So if you're reading, I don't know, say Vox Latina or something similar to that, and an author uses the word non solutio, you might be confused by it, but you can refer to the Silva and find the English translation of that Latin term. So too, I've given another example here of the word for a churro, which is a Spanish pastry. I don't know why you would need, but anyway. So as I say here, there are no philological annotations. There's no linguistic rumination on the text or the words that are present at all. Words are not in the Silva marked with an asterisk or with an X or with a crossbones and skull telling you don't ever use this word. The judgment is left for another place, and the Silva just provides a depository, as I said. Some of these words, therefore, are hapax legomena. They may have appeared once in Palestra Latina, which was a newspaper published in Spain in the 1930s through 50s, in which at varying periods there were great Latinists, and at other times it seemed like there were schoolboys writing in the newspaper. And so those appear there. Also, words appear that are clearly just calques from modern languages, words that I've cited here that might not be the most eloquent selections when speaking Latin. The problem, therefore, and these are some of the detriments of just having a Silva or just referring to a Silva, is that once a student or even a scholar sees a word in print, they tend to both remember it better and to think that it's a legitimate usage, which I think often is not, but that's probably a conversation for another time. Now the Adumbratio, which is the other half of the Lexicon Morganianum, is just the opposite. Instead of being a depository and a hopper of words from various lexica, it is in fact a collection of words directly from literature. Now that literature can span from a number of different periods, right? I mean, as many of us heard in Dr. Turnberg's lecture just an hour ago, there are a plethora of words from the ancient period that apply perfectly well to modern items. There's often no reason to invent new words or even to look to a later period. And so, for instance, here's an example. I've heard people come up with all sorts of bizarre words for sock, including socos, which unfortunately means something different. But here in the Adumbratio, we have citations from Petronius, from Pliny, as well as from the Vatican lexicon and from Helfer, which is another lexicon we'll talk about later, and from Suetonius. So that's really the primary advantage of the Adumbratio, is that it is culled primarily from literature. And not just literature in the sense of the belles lettres, but literature from all genres. Care has been taken that the words that are, the texts that are used in the corpus from which we draw lemmata are of a high caliber. So for instance, we wouldn't take prose composition from an undergraduate course at your local college and consider that was Latin literature. Rather, this is literature that is written with an ability of Latin that demonstrates an understanding of both the syntax, the grammar, and the nature of the language. But that doesn't preclude looking to specific disciplines, like looking at doctoral theses or dissertations and scientific texts. So over dinner last night or 2 nights ago, someone said, there's no way in Latin to say sulfuric acid. And that is why I ended up choosing this example from the lexicon. And as I said, some words are taken from contemporary Latin periodicals judiciously, right? So Carlos Egger, wrote prolifically in Latinitas magazine. Latinitas magazine is now defunct, and that might not be such a bad thing, considering the level of Latinity that we saw in the last 4 or 5 years of its existence. And so some words are taken from periodicals, but as I said, judiciously. Another virtue of the Adumbratio, which cuts both ways, is that there is linguistic analysis and commentary on words within the article. Now, I don't expect to read all of this, and I don't expect you to read all of this, but you can tell here that there is a copious discussion of the best way to say ice hockey. One of the most important matters in classics today, how to say ice hockey in Latin. Well, there was a push for one term for a while, ausulegia, and perhaps that's not the best term. I'll leave you to read this entire article on your own time. You can print it out and leave it next to the toilet at home. So one thing that we have both as an advantage but also as a problem moving forward is that we don't have a set corpus for the Morgan lexicon. So what's a corpus? I'm not talking about a dead body, but a corpus is a body of literature, a body of letters from either a period or a place or an author. So many of us have used corpora before, probably. The most basic corpora that you may be familiar with are the Collins or the British National Corpus. But you've probably, if you are in classics, you've probably used other corpora. For instance, the OLD was built on a corpus that spans all the way to 180 AD. Lewis and Short, however, goes much further. It goes from Plautus to the 9th century, more or less. If you are very familiar with Lewis and Short, you've probably seen that Lewis and Short made some strange decisions and included things from way beyond the 9th century and didn't include things from within the 9th century. So they didn't have a clear idea of what their corpus was when they set out. Souter, who wrote the Oxford Dictionary of Later Latin, he goes even further to the 10th century, again with some exceptions. Other examples of corpora that you probably are familiar with are the Packard Humanities Institute discs. Perseus is also in some sense a corpus. And then the first corpus that was made in the classics in a loose sense, the first corpus of Latin that was made electronically available in 1983 by a Jesuit by the name of Bussa, or Bussi, and by IBM, is the Corpus Thomisticum, which is now available free on the internet. The Morgan lexicon is not the only lexicon of Neo-Latin that aims to cull directly from literature. There are other things out there. For instance, there's the Lexicon Auxiliare by Helfer. This gentleman read dissertations from 2 centuries and culled all of the vocabulary that he found from literally thousands of dissertations. Then we have Hoven, which is today par excellence the academic go-to lexicon for Renaissance or Neo-Latin. There are other options like Johann Raminger, who is a fellow at the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae in Munich. And there are some other digital options that we'll talk about. One of the aims of the lexicon is to be relevant not just to the scholar, but also to students of Latin. Students of Latin until now generally have to use Trautmann's, or Trautveer as he once wanted to be called, Trautmann's glossary, which actually, I have to admit, in the 4th edition is not so bad, but the first 3 editions, well, the 4th edition is not so bad. And so by putting this out there, making it available on the internet, and making it a reliable source, students have access to vocabulary that they can use and can rely on without falling into solecisms or barbarisms. On the other hand, we also want to be a source for scholars. And as I say, this is unfortunately more of a hope than a reality. The the lexicon, both because of the format and because of the lack of a clear and articulated corpus, currently is not an academic resource. And that is certainly something moving forward that we'd like to change. An example of an academic resource that is digitally available would be Raminger. Now, I'm going to click on this link, and I'm not sure that anything's going to happen because I've not tried this before. But I gave you a handout, and your handout has a bar on it. It's, I think, the bigger of the two bars. And if you scan that bar with your Z phone or your computer, or I'm told that it will bring you to where I want to go. So this is Raminger. And what Raminger has now is he's now reached 20,000 articles, which is amazing. It's a really wonderful resource. And we have both the authors on one side, and we have words on the other. So I didn't think to pick a word in advance, but let's look at a word here. We have what looks much like an article or an entry head in a academic, professionally published dictionary. It looks, unfortunately, different from the current layout in the Morgan lexicon. On the right, as I said, we have the authors, so we know immediately what authors are included and what authors have not yet been used in the corpus. Okay. Moreover, we have a really great interface. We have an interface that is user-friendly, more or less. It doesn't have bells and whistles, but you don't need bells and whistles in a lexicon. And this has a really great URL. Right? It's easy to remember, and it's easy to link to. So let's talk very briefly about the structure of dictionaries. You have a structure that pertains to the overall layout of a lexicon, and then you have the structure that pertains to particular lemmata or articles, right? So generally, we have a head word. After the head word, we might have other information. A head word in Latin would be something like volo or amo, right? And then after that, you have the other essential information that we're all familiar with. You need to know whether the word is first, third conjugation. You need to know whether it's a noun or a verb, so on and so forth. But then the more important things follow, really. You need to know the semantic value. You need to know the range. You need to know how it's used, where it appears, and what's really fascinating now with corpus linguistics, you need to know collocations. You need to know with what other words it frequently appears, right? And that's something we can do now that traditional paper dictionaries just can't do. For instance, until fairly recently, my lifetime, classes didn't know, apparently, that expedit and impedit appear in high frequency in collocations together. Well, now with corpus linguistics, we can do things like that. And then when we see those together, we don't think that this is a pun or this is a one-off, and so on and so forth. So the lexicon differs in this respect from other traditional, specifically paper lexica, in that it is ideological. So it doesn't follow the alphabetic order of words, but rather it follows the thematics of the language. So here's an example from just a random dictionary that I took, and this is what an article should look like, right? Especially in a print lexicon. And in that article, we have the head words, and as I said in our example, we would have volo, and then after that we would want to know, is this volo vele or is this volo volonis, the noun? Is this volens, volt? How does the head word relate to other morphological forms that we'll find? Then, for instance, we need to know whether there are particular phrases that appear. For instance, virilis, in the sense of manly, means something slightly then when someone says pro virili parte or pro virili, and that needs to appear somewhere in the head word, right? Then you need to decide how words that have strange orthography will appear, right? For instance, Barbaro-Graicus is frequently a term used to describe modern Greek or Demotic Greek. Well, hyphenated words, those don't appear traditionally in Latin lexica. Wittgenstein's title of his work, Logico Philosophicus, how do we deal with stuff like that? And so we need to distinguish among different orthographies, and to a lesser extent in Latin, phonologies, right? So unfortunately, in traditional lexica, we don't have any phonological explanations, which I think is a real desideratum, right? Most Latin students don't know, for instance, that the accent on the famous Roman patron was at probably Mykenas and not Mykenas. That Cicero ought to be called Arpinas, probably, and not Arpinas. That the accent should probably be ad hoc and not, I'm not sure about that one, look, and so on and so forth. Well, in the consideration of time, we'll move on to a clearer article here. So this is what I would describe as a complex article. In it, we've got a lot of information. It's not as complex and as complete as an article in, say, the TLL, of the Source Linguae Latina. It's not as complicated or as complete as an example from the OED, but for our purposes, it has everything that we would expect in a professional and academic lexicon. So let's look at these parts. So this is our head word, right? This would be our WOLO. Then we have the phonetics. There may be a desideratum there in Latin lexica. We have, for instance, other translations, if this is a bilingual dictionary, which the lexicon currently is. We need to know what grammatical context it falls into, if it's a noun or verb. Then we need to know the senses within the verb, within the word. If there's a verb form, for instance, I talked about volo versus volo, the noun versus the verb. Then we have other signposts that might appear parenthetically. And then we have contextualizations, what this word means in a particular given context or collocation. And that's something that's really valuable for contextualizing words, is what the collocates of that word are elsewhere in literature. And then, and again, this is another desideratum in most Latin lexica, barring perhaps the TLL, is that a good dictionary ought to tell us what register a word falls into. That is it sublime? Is it vernaculum? And then, just like we see in the TLL and in the OLD, we don't continuously write out the entire form because that gets tiring on the eyes, and in the case of printed dictionaries, costs more money. So, moving forward, we have two real goals, two immediate goals. And one is to bring the lexicon into greater conformity with lexicography and the lexicographical arts as they're being developed today. And that will result in a lexicon that looks like other lexica and can be compared on its merits. Currently, it's very difficult to look at the lexicon and compare it with anything else. And then that will both make it more accessible to scholars, but will also increase the relevance for students. So if students have an accessible and clean interface, and they know exactly what abbreviations mean and what signposts mean, they can use the lexicon in a more effective, efficient way. And actually, these two goals will result in a third goal, which is that overall, the lexicon will simply be more valuable to all. So that's an abbreviated edition of the talk for consideration of time. I would ask you if we have any questions, or while I take questions, if you would also look at the lexicon. The other barcode that I've given you is a link to the lexicon. So if you have any questions, you can look at it while we're talking. So I'll open up the floor for questions. And as an aside, since we have coffee that is up against this session, it's probably not a problem if we run over. So I'll hold the floor for a couple of more minutes and then turn it over to whoever's speaking after me. Yes?
To what extent are you thinking about following Ravager, which is a lexicon that I use all the time and find it incredibly useful and easy to use?
Yeah. Well, I expect to follow him in having a cleaner interface and having a better written code for the page.
What about the citations and sources?
Well, Ravager, because he's at TLL, he's got a lot of resources. And so I've already written for 2 grants this year. One, basically a personal one, to learn more about lexicography. And with that grant, I hope to be able to follow more closely in the footsteps of lexicograph authors of Lexica who can produce something as clean and as crisp as Ravager. But as I said, he's got great sources. He's at TLL, so he's got research assistants. He's got computers, which currently, we don't have any of those things. So I do hope to follow more closely sort of in certain respects. But in other respects, there are 2 different projects, right? Ravager basically just includes words that he comes across haphazardly. The goal of the Morgan lexicon is to provide users of active Latin with a resource that they can go to find equivalents and words that would be useful to them. Secondarily, I hope that in the future it can be turned into something like Ravager, where readers of Neo-Latin of any period from Petrarch on can go to it. That's a little ambitious, but we'll see. Any other questions? Yes.
So first of all, this is wonderful. Thank you for especially the words on Morgan and explaining to me the difference between the Silva and Adumbratio, which I don't think I really understood until right now. So thank you. I just within the scope of even what you're allowed to do with what you have, is there any interest in making it an open source project to draw on the largest body of people to contribute?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. So because of a technical glitch, I didn't have any of my notes for this talk, which I'm sure that showed. But in fact, yeah, that is one of the goals, is to systematize the project together with a board of directors. So I would like to put together a board of directors and receive slips from other readers of Latin. So for instance, if you read Neo-Latin or if you read any period of Latin, you come across an item that you think ought to be in the lexicon, you can write up a slip. And I have a format for how slips can be submitted. And I've received a couple of slips, literally a couple, over the last now 2.5 years or so. And so I'd like to receive more. I'd like to have help from other people who are interested and certainly competent. So yeah, I would like to open it up and make it open source. And the difference between the Silva and the Adumbratio, I didn't have the time that I would have liked to talk about David and his life at greater length. But David was really a saintly man, patient almost to a fault. And I think that he might roll in his grave if he were to see on the internet how many people mistake the Silva for David's lexicon. So that if you leave this session knowing one thing, please know the difference between the Silva and the Adumbratio. Okay, well, thank you for your patience and your tolerance.